Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. This episode is going to be a landmark episode. We're going to talk about the Spanish Civil War.
Very excited.
Yes, this is something we've kind of thought about doing an episode for quite some time, but this is a conflict where it's so dang complicated that we kind of felt like we needed to do a bit more research and get a little bit more ready for it before diving into it.
Yeah, I've read a whole book.
I also read a book. I read
one whole book. I read one whole book. No, we did do some reading beforehand because it's something that I've always known about and known the basic sketch of it, but the details were something that I just didn't know as much about.
Right. For instance, I don't know, like as a young person, not really knowing anything about it, I thought Franco was the government and the Republic. You know, I didn't really think about why it was called the Republic. I thought they were the rebels, but no, it's the exact opposite. It's basically in 1936, you have the Spanish Republic. There's a left coalition that wins. A popular front gets voted into their governing body. And in response to this, a bunch of generals get together and decide they're going to overthrow the government in a coup.
Yeah, but it's the Spanish Republic was founded in 1931, that basically throughout the previous monarchy. There was a minor uprising in 1934, but it's in 36 is this big uprising that they lead that ultimately leads to Spanish Civil War. Ultimately, this conflict that breaks out that rages for over 3 years and is a real preface in many ways to the Second World War.
I mean, it ends right before the Second World War begins.
About 4 or 5 months before, basically.
Yeah.
And it's a proving ground sort of for both sides, and we're going to talk more about that. But ultimately, the Republicans actually start out with more of advantages in a sense, but the nationalists sort of slowly chip away. And as we talk about some of these scenarios, why they did that, but ultimately they defeat these Spanish Republicans and take over the whole country. Franco originally was not the leader of the Nationalists, something we will also address, but he becomes a dictator of Spain and rules until, I think, 1975.
Yeah, I believe that is correct, yeah. The same year that Portugal gave up its colonies in Africa and whatnot.
Yes.
Yeah.
But let's talk about some divergences where we see some changes. And actually, as we were going through this before the episode, there are a lot of potential divergences in the Spanish Civil War, some of which could have some real major impacts upon Europe, particularly if World War II occurs in roughly the same way it does.
Right.
So I think our first one is about Sanjurjo or Sanjurjo.
I believe it's Sanjurjo. It's spelled like with 2 J's in it. Kind of looks like...
it looks like Sanjurjo, but it's Sanjurjo.
There's a really good movie called Sanjuro, starring Toshiro Mifune. It's one of those samurai movies. It's pretty good.
Never seen it.
It's the sequel to Yojimbo.
Oh.
Yeah. It's a pretty funny movie.
Nice. Well, Sanjurjo. So, Max, tell our listeners, if they don't know, about the General Sanjurjo.
So, Sanjurjo attempted to do a coup beforehand, like a couple years previous, and it ended up failing. He got kicked out of the country and was sent to Portugal. So he was kind of biding his time in Portugal, like trying to create these conspiracies to take over the government. And lo and behold, one of those conspiracies comes to fruition, the attempted coup in 1936. So in like the opening days of this coup, he secures an airplane to go fly to Spain to join the rebellion, but he had too many trunks full of uniforms in his plane, so like the plane was overladen, so they weren't able to lift off properly, and I guess flew into a bunch of trees or something and dies right at the beginning of the rebellion. So the leader is dead immediately.
And what I read from the book I read said that apparently instead of flying a transport plane at the time, which they did have like civilian transport planes that could carry 15 to 20 people, instead of flying on one of those, he wanted to fly in on like a smaller plane. And because that was like more romantic or more interesting. And the one pilot was like, this is too many clothes. And apparently the story goes, as he said, like the caudillo of Spain must be properly dressed.
To his funeral.
Yeah, well, that's the way it kind of turned out to be.
Yeah.
But the death of Sanjurjo is actually a big change because, I mean, everyone anticipated that Sanjurjo would be the leader of this rebellion and of these forces, and his very early death. I mean, very early in the process. In the first weeks of this uprising really changes the face of it. And it's actually the point of divergence for one of the big... There is, unlike some areas, there is some alternate history out there about the Spanish Civil War. Probably the most prominent is the War That Came Early series from Harry Turtledove.
Yeah, I read most of that. I read until this book called Two Fronts, which is, I think, the 4th out of 5, I think. And it's good. I like it. I think Turtledove does a good job. But he's Harry Turtledove, and you know how he is, especially when he writes these big, long series. He kind of says the same thing over and over again.
You know that Sam Karsten burns very easily in the sun. Yeah,
there's characters who have very similar lack of story arcs like that. It's just the same thing over and over again. And a big part of that series takes place in Spain. Sanjurjo, in his book, survives. And for whatever reason, since he survives, the nationalists do a worse job running the war. And there's more, friction between the different generals. And there's a character who's part of the International Brigades who is in a whole bunch of books. He's an American guy. There's also a nationalist character, too, but he dies in, the first book, I think, pretty unceremoniously. But...
Interesting. And that's something that what raises an interesting point to talk about, which is the nationalists were not this, united front. They're made up of these different groups of... You had the phalange, I think, a phalange.
Yeah, it means phalanx in Spanish.
In Spanish. And then you have people who generally were more religious, who didn't like that, the Spanish Republic was anti-religious. And then you also had my favorite group, the Carlists, which were these ultra-religious
monarchists,
but they weren't monarchists in the traditional way. They supported a different line of nobility as the rightful rulers of Spain.
That's because there was a guy named Don Carlo, Count of Molina, who was, I guess, supposed to be king, but some other guy took over for him. And that's the line of Alfonso. And the Carlist line went off in a different direction.
It's interesting enough, at the beginning stages of the war was kind of this rush for both sides to kind of organize. And the nationalists were not totally unified, but it was more easy to unify them, and Franco was that real unifying force, than the Republican side. And that's one of the things that really doomed the Republican side to losing, amongst many things, was that they just weren't as unified. And kind of the nationalists, because they had sort of the military as one of the leading parts of it, just were better organized in a sense, not as disunified as some of... Not to say that the Republican units didn't put up good fighting. Some of them were very ferocious in fighting, but organization and discipline in a military means something.
Yeah. The idea of the Popular Front is kind of a myth, is that it's not like everyone's all buddy-buddy and everyone's working together. I mean, during the war, there was a miniature civil war on the side of the left, where the government was cracking down on the CNT and a bunch of stuff like that. And the POUM, the communists going after them. So, it's a fractured,
you had these anarchists,
chaotic,
communists. I mean, it really was remarkable. And then you even had Basque separatists, who, even though the Basque traditionally are some of the most religious people, Catholics in Spain, St. Ignatius of Loyola is a Basque.
I didn't know that.
No. But the Basque country was so pro-Basque nationalists that they allied somewhat uneasily with the Republicans, but ultimately it fell pretty quickly within about a year. But so basically the story of the Spanish Civil War is that the Republicans, even though they start out with more resources, sort of the nationalists just chip away. And also you have the high level of international involvement, and that's something I think people are very aware of. The international brigades for the Republicans, the Condor Legion for the Germans. Because the Condor Legion was primarily air, there was some ground forces, and there was a small naval contingent. And the Italians sent a lot of troops, actually.
Yes, yeah.
The Italians sent something like 70,000 troops or something like that.
And tanks, too. Italian tanks, though. So.
Well, this is also 1936, so everyone's the U.S. Army still has FT-17 Renaults. So
the Spanish had FT-17s too.
They did, yeah.
Actually, France sold a bunch to them, in Poland too. Weirdly enough, I don't know why, but France back in 1936, 1937 had a Popular Front government. Leon Blum was a pretty far left socialist guy. Mm-hmm. He initially supported the Republic, but got kind of badgered into the neutrality agreement where Britain and France would just say, hands off, we're not going to do anything. and the Soviet Union, Italy, and Germany also signed this, but totally ignored it. Just did it anyway.
And the Soviets became the prime supporters of the Republican forces, and that did certainly affect the war because you didn't really have the British and the French supplying them, and the Soviet Union gained more and more leverage over the Spanish Republicans as the war went on. And they even, as down payment for a lot of the stuff they provided, like most of the gold reserves of the Spanish Republican government got shipped to Moscow.
Yep, straight there. And they had some very creative accounting when it came to the exchange rate for this money. Like they kind of got screwed over just a little bit. Though Kotkin says that if you really look at it, like the amount of training they were doing and all this stuff, that actually is kind of a fair deal. But yeah, all their gold gets sent to Stalin. And Stalin, in return, gets to test out his technology, gets to send people to test out different types of warfare. I mean, it's kind of a big success for him.
Yeah, no, because he sent mainly a lot of pilots for fighting purposes, but they tried out a lot of tanks. They were Soviet advisors. It's this interesting showdown between the Allies and the Axis, sort of, before the war.
Another reason why Stalin wanted to get involved with Spain is because Trotsky was egging him on. He was writing in the Bulletin of the Opposition about how, like, we're having this conflict in Spain between fascism and anti-fascism, and Stalin's just sitting on his hands because he's a coward and he's a Termidorian, you know, all this stuff. There were a lot of people in Spain that were, I don't know if they were Trotskyists, but they were anti-Stalinist communists, which ipso facto to Stalin means you're a Trotskyist. So he wanted to preclude any chance of there being a non-Soviet communist power in Europe getting involved as a way to influence the Republic that way.
Yeah, absolutely. But so back to the Sanjurjo, if he survives. It's hard to predict how this is going to go, but perhaps a less united... I mean, will the Nationalists eventually win? I think they would still win, although maybe a different way to victory, because Franco really was a unifying force.
Yeah. Franco was also extremely cautious. He would take things very, very slowly, chip away slowly over time. That's part of the reason why the war took so long, is because he was advancing very, very slowly. So maybe if you have more of like a brash hothead in charge, which I don't know if that's what Sanjurjo was like, but... you know, that could change the war. It could end it faster, or it could be more disastrous for the Nationalists, kind of the way that Turtledove supposes.
I mean, the Republicans, while they had issues, for sure, were a formidable fighting force. You know, the international brigades didn't do as much as people said, although they did fight.
Yeah, more of a propaganda thing. So, you know, they really appreciated them, but the newspapers made them out to be like they're these elite, kicking ass everywhere, they're the best. And though some of them were great war veterans, so you know they had experience, unlike all these Spanish people. Spain wasn't in the Great War.
It wasn't, but Portugal was.
Portugal was, though. Very true. The only experience any soldier would have in Spain is with like fighting Moroccans in the Rif War,
and those were almost all on the Nationalist side.
Yes, the Army of Africa. Yeah.
Rif War,
which that was Franco's bailiwick. That was his wheelhouse. He was
the Spanish Foreign Legion. They also had a Foreign Legion.
They did, yeah.
And they had a really interesting like slogan, something about like we embrace death or something.
Viva muerte, yes.
Long live death. That's what it was. But they fought in the Rif War, and then they do fight in the Spanish Civil War, and in fact are very impactful. And I think this is another. It really kind of starts in Spanish Morocco, which is like a heartland of the Nationalists, because that's where you have the Spanish army in Africa, where Franco comes from. So the early stages of the war are very chaotic. It very much depended on, I think, as we were talking before, Max, you had said about how it really depended, like what the commanding officer in an area said, you know, I'm allied with this side or whatever. It's very chaotic. And one of the real moments that gives the Nationalists kind of a lift up is that German planes, primarily Ju-52s, transfer Franco and a large portion of the Army of Africa to southern Spain, and then they're a very organized fighting force, and they take a lot of southern Spain and actually drive towards Madrid, and kind of solidified a nationalist sort of advantage at the beginning of the war.
Yeah.
But what if they don't get transported that way?
It's totally reasonable. I mean, Hitler decided to do it kind of on the spur of a moment against the advice of many of his advisors. Like, I think Goering was like, this is a bad idea, we shouldn't do it. And he did it anyway. So if he can't get across that channel, I mean, most of the Navy is owned by the Republic.
Yes, the Republic did have more of a hold on the Navy. What if they can't get these forces over? Maybe that does give the Republicans an advantage in the early stages of the war.
Yeah.
And perhaps they have to get transferred by boat by the Italians or something like that, and that takes longer. Or the Italians are distracted for some reason.
Yeah. I could totally see, like, Italy, if you wanted to make a plausible divergence to keep Italy out of the war, maybe Italy decides we're going to attack Albania or something. And it just so happens to happen the day before the coup starts. So they're completely distracted doing something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so,
absolutely. Yeah, they could be totally screwed if they did that.
And that would give the Republicans certainly an advantage. And that leads us into, what about if there was no civil war at all?
People in the lead up to the Civil War were getting very pumped up, very radicalized. People were thinking that violence was the only way to settle their irreconcilable differences between one another. So, I mean, it's not surprising that a civil war happened. But hey, cooler heads maybe could prevail. I don't know. Sanjurjo, maybe he doesn't do his coup. He doesn't go to Portugal, and he's quite happy in his position, and he doesn't want to do anything. He just wants to sit back and relax, sitting in a barracks somewhere or something. I don't know.
Sounds fun.
Like right before, actually, interesting fact, a lot of the generals were actually in weird places because the Republic had kind of pseudo-exiled them to try to keep them from plotting together to make a coup. Like, I think Franco was in the Canary Islands at the beginning of this whole thing.
Yes.
And Moya was in the Balearic Islands. Yeah. Which, it's so funny because it's like, haven't you guys heard of airplanes? You can just...
Well, he was flown by... They was an airplane did transfer Franco from the Canary Islands to North Africa, and then ultimately they're transferred to Spain.
Yeah.
But yeah, they were flown and somewhat...
Just fire him if you don't. Like, why do you have to exile him?
Maybe it's sort of like keep your friends closer, your enemies closer. Like, it's better to keep him under some sort of watch, instead of him just being a civilian that you have no reason to watch or something like that. So,
and I mean, of course, the right has a lot to blame for the war starting, but also, there's on the left there was a lot of very incendiary language, like Largo Caballero said something to the effect of like, if the right wins this election, it will mean war, civil war, violence in the streets, So it's like, he seems to think a civil war is going to happen too.
Yeah, and I think Spain was kind of boiling towards that position. But let's say for some reason that's averted. How does this affect? Obviously, there's no testing ground for some of like the Germans' primary fighter in World War II, the Bf-109, the Messerschmitt 109, is first used in Spain.
Ju-87s also.
Ju-87 Stukas are tested out in Spain. I think the early Heinkel 111s. Actually, funny enough, the Ju-52s, those tri-motors are actually used as bombers too, like in Guernica.
Well, if there's no interceptor craft, then you can just,
A lot of Soviet planes and tanks were used. I think German tanks were actually used too. So like
Panzer ones.
Panzer one with two little machine guns. Look at the difference between 1936, the Panzer one, or 37 or whenever it comes out, and 1945, King Tiger, a Koenig Tiger. Way different. Or the difference between a Soviet tank in 1936 or an American tank. Or in planes, same thing. The Me-262 in 1945. And, the putsy little biplanes are like,
the Polikarpov P-3s or whatever.
Yeah, the I-15s, the I-16s, the I-153s, the Chateau, and the Rata. Those are they called them.
The first fighter aircraft to have retractable landing craft.
That's a huge step.
Yeah.
It's a lot less drag.
I mean, you look at it now and it looks like this dinky piece of crap, but it was a big deal. It's revolutionary for its time.
Oh, for sure. So let's say, no Spanish Civil War, so there's not that impact, and obviously you don't have the impact of all these people who are fighting against fascism, or you sort of see the sort of aggression of these fascist regimes or whatever. But my feeling is that World War II is probably going to start roughly in the same way, because obviously the Germans are still going to take Austria, still, Czechoslovakia. Maybe you don't have as many people raising the alarm about the dangers of Nazism or whatever. The interesting thing about how this gets to is that, let's just say World War II plays out roughly the same way. So somewhere in the mid-1940, France falls. Germany still kind of rolls on, whatever. What happens with Spain? Because remember, the pre-revolution government is a Spanish republic. While not as extreme as some of the Republicans will get during the Civil War, is still a left-wing government. So does Germany invade Spain?
Gosh, that seems like such a big investment, though, because Spain's such rough terrain. You have to go over the dang Pyrenees.
Well, the Pyrenees seem like such a big buffer, but not
Impossible. Yeah.
Not impossible to get over. Are you going to see the Iberia Corps? General Rommel and the Iberia Corps. It's a lot tougher, but also, in the long German tradition of making the same mistakes Napoleon makes, so they did invade Russia. Why wouldn't they invade Spain and then get caught down in this really tough terrain? You're going to see General Franco leading Spanish troops against the Germans. Which, quick side note, Franco was not very well liked by the Germans.
Yeah.
And even though he was like was like a fascist government, I remember reading there's something about what Hitler said about the time he met with Franco was like, I never want to meet with that man again. What was it? You said something when we were discussing.
I think there was like somebody was going to meet with Franco, and they described him as being less like a conquering hero and more like a small fat sausage was a good way to describe him. But yeah, he was very like Franco would say like, oh, I might join the war. I'm going to need all of Tunisia. I'm going to need everything in Tunisia and a bunch of France's colonies in Africa. And it's like, no, you're not going to be that helpful to us. And just kind of didn't really help the Germans a ton, because like Hitler wanted him to take Gibraltar, and he's like, nah, I'm not going to do that. That would be foolish for me to do that. So
probably because he realized if you do that, then you're throwing your lot in with the Germans, and if they lose, I'm not going to be the head of Spain anymore. Because that sort of thing is that you throw your dice in with the Germans, like if they lose, like the Allies aren't going to be like, well, we forgot about that time with Gibraltar.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Finland, Paasikivi, I think, was still in charge of Finland after World War II. So
but that's Finland.
That's Finland. Yeah, that's true. Not Spain.
Not Spain. But
they're not directly attacking the British.
So do you have, I guess as you point out, so if the Germans end up invading Spain in this situation to remove this sort of danger on their flank.
Or maybe like Spain, for some reason, made an alliance with France right before 1940. Yeah. So now they're de facto at war.
Yeah, de facto. So the war in France has to continue into Spain. Is it going to become, I think you pointed out, is this Italy in reverse? Is this, the way the Allies have to drive up the Italian peninsula in 43 through 45? Is this how Spain is to the Germans? Because it is terrible. It's tough terrain to fight in. It's not blitzkrieg warfare is not designed for Spanish. I mean, you do have these broader plains as you get towards Madrid, and obviously the British are going to send troops.
Yeah.
And is this going to affect
another expeditionary force?
Yes, the BEF relocates to Spain. Do you have obviously French troops retreating into Spain, fighting from there?
Maybe the Germans don't go into Norway or anything like that.
Or is it going to affect, maybe the North Africa campaign's not so substantial because their troops are fighting their way in Spain.
Yeah.
Is that somehow affect like a potential war with the Soviet Union? The U.S. eventually gets involved. Is there no Operation Torch? It's just U.S. troops landing in Cadiz or whatever and marching to go fight against the Germans is somewhere in Spain. So. And here's the difference too is that the Allies now have a springboard there is no need for a second front in the traditional sense, because you already do have one. You're already on the continent. You just have to, you're seeing in 44, the Allies at the Pyrenees, and they have to conduct, there's no D-Day. There's a landing somewhere in southern France to outflank the Germans or whatever like that.
Amphibious operations are really, really hard and really, really risky. D-Day worked, but Anzio, they can go really bad.
Yeah, and Anzio didn't even go the worst it could go, which is pretty remarkable.
Is there any landings? I think the very first landing at the beginning of Operation Torch was kind of a mess.
Oh, it was disaster. Yeah. I mean, read
Army at Dawn.
An Army at Dawn, fantastic book.
Yes,
that whole series, amazing, so good. I was trying to remember who wrote the book, and it's Rick Atkinson, but the name that first came to my head was Rick Ross.
Ricky Rose.
No.
He
Ricky
did
Martin. No.
He did a music video with Skrillex and with that guy who plays the Joker in Suicide Squad. in character.
Jared Leto?
Yeah, Jared Leto in character as the Joker. And it's just horrifically bad. It is the most embarrassing thing I've seen in my life.
I once watched Suicide Squad on an airplane. I was really bored.
That's a great airplane
And I was
movie.
even more bored after I watched. Well, yeah, because it's like one of those things like, I guess I want to watch it, but I've got nothing else to do, because if you were on the ground, you'd be like, I've got something better to do.
Airplane movies are movies that you under no circumstance would see on your own, but you're just so bored. Okay, I'll watch the RoboCop reboot, sure.
Well, yeah, I've got nowhere else to be.
Yeah.
It's not like I can step out for a second.
The Lego Batman movie, okay, sure.
Oh, man. But back to the point. So it would change the face of how the Allies fight the war if they're getting pulled into Spain, because, the North Africa campaign for the British obviously was costly, but nowhere near as costly as the Continental campaign never ends. Mm-hmm. So the Americans have greater role earlier on because the British are more exhausted. Is there like a French government in exile in Madrid, something like that?
In addition, tank development and whatnot would be greatly accelerated because you have all those years where you're just kind of like not really doing very much. Sure, there's North Africa and whatnot, but if there's like hard fighting all the time in Spain for years and years, that's going to push technological advancement.
And you don't have to take the risk of something like D-Day because you already have a continental base. And the Mediterranean is way more open to the Allies.
Yeah.
If you think about it, in 1942, what do the Allies have? Gibraltar, which is surrounded by a potentially unfriendly force. Malta, which is basically under siege by air, by unfriendly forces, and then Egypt.
Well, speaking of Malta, now you have the Balearic Islands and all these islands to put air bases on, too. Mm-hmm. And you can't sink an island. That's the beauty of them, Yeah.
So this is really changing the face of World War II. I think that's an interesting thing and something that could be fun to be fleshed out in a story or something like that.
It also gives Stalin less things to complain about because, he was always saying, like, we're losing hundreds of thousands of people every month, and you're doing nothing. Now the Allies can say, no, we are doing something. Mm-hmm. We are contributing.
And how will that affect the Russian front and all that? Who knows?
Who knows?
Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Maybe there will be, maybe more troops somewhere in North Africa under Rommel, which the Africa Corps, as much as they call it a corps, was pretty much a glorified, was not an army. It was a corps. I mean, that wasn't just like a, cool designation, whatever. I mean, at one point after El Alamein, they're down to like 15 tanks or something like that, something crazy.
And no fuel
basically
to move them, yeah.
Are you going to see a lot of Italian troops fighting in Spain? Mussolini. I could see the Germans doing that, sending like one army, and then being like, Italy, you're going to have to pick up the pace here.
Okay, Hungary, this is you now. Yeah. Okay, Romania, go get them.
Yeah. Well, the Spanish also did send troops to divergence to real history. Send troops to the Eastern Front.
Yes.
The Blue Division.
Blue is the color of the phalange.
Mm-hmm. So let's address the clearest divergence here, which would be the Republicans winning. Mm-hmm. And obviously, I think we've kind of hinted at how they would do this, which is there would have to be some early on advantages. Maybe Franco can't get his army of Africa over as early as he does, which they just rampage through southern Spain in 36. That doesn't happen. The Republicans get more advantages.
Other things they could do is just be faster when it comes to combating the nationalists. Like, for instance, they didn't open up the armories and arm workers and volunteers immediately. And as a result, they were basically helpless against the nationalists. They couldn't fight them at all. And also just being more proactive about arresting suspicious generals that might defect to the nationalists. Because, I think there was at least one case where a person pretended to be for the Republic and then, whoops, nope, I'm not, and then turned a whole city based on that.
Yeah. With the Republicans winning, if they find some way to do this, defeat the nationalists, again, what does your role come up in World War II that happens? Do they get involved? Do they join the French? Or are they so exhausted from defeating the nationalists that they don't get involved? Are the Germans going to invade? Or are they just going to be... I mean, it is going to change the view of how the war happens if the war happens in this way, because let's say they don't get involved. They're too exhausted. They're like, we just fought the Civil War. We can't get involved. What is Republican Spain? A huge problem for the Germans, because all these French resistance fighters or whatever, there could be a French government in exile. That's where we'd probably likely go.
Espionage activity happening over the border.
Yeah, right there. Lots of people could flee there and cause an issue. And in fact, one of our favorite series, this is a divergence, sort of, in the Draca series. If you read that history, Republicans win the Spanish Civil War, and also apparently the people who fight the Draca the best throughout the series, interestingly enough. We'll talk about it.
Huh. Mm-hmm. I wonder if the Draca sent a volunteer legion.
I don't think so. So I think the Republicans winning is interesting. What does a post-war Spain look like? Very different than Franco's Spain, although I'm not an expert on Franco's Spain. I think it would be more problematic, honestly, from the U.S.'s point, because Franco is clearly not a communist.
No.
And Spain joined NATO.
But it took a lot of time for them to join NATO.
They were delayed.
They didn't even join the UN until 1955, I think. So they were a pariah state for a decade, before they eventually begrudgingly were allowed to join the European community.
And then Republican Spain is also going to be quite disorganized because you have all these anarchists. Part of Catalonia kind of was independent during this.
The Generalitat, yeah.
Yeah, they're still trying to do it.
I guess the big thing is, when does the war end? Because if it's just a fast... it's a failed coup, it's over in 6 months. You don't have the crushing problems that the nationalists had at the end of their war. They fought all those years, and they were almost at famine conditions at the end of it. Spain was in absolutely no condition to fight anybody.
Yeah. Spain in the 40s is a bad decade. I think I remember reading in this book I read about it, they said, you came to Spain in the 40s, and it was a depressing, terrible place. Especially since the victors of it still have to live with the fact in any civil war where your opponents often are still living there. So you have that.
Yeah. If it's a long war, if it's a war that takes a very long time to finally grind down the nationalists, let's say Franco's stuck in Morocco. He's still there. You still have to beat him eventually. So how do you do that? You have to go to him or something.
Or they split. That's a fascist republic in Northern Africa.
The Cadillo of Morocco.
Franco. No, it's interesting, the idea of a Republican victory is not some assured, you read some of the literature, people who were friendly to the Republican side, and they thought this was just paradise or whatever like that. But
there's a lot of that. The Spanish Civil War is a very interesting war in that it is one where the losers have written most of the history. Most people are very, very, very much getting the Republican side of things.
That's a good point.
It causes people to maybe have some misconceptions about the conflict because they're mostly getting it from one perspective or one facet of the Republican perspective. Oh, you know what? Anarcho-Syndicalists are the best and communists are the worst. I don't know.
It's interesting, and this is very almost romantic,
a
romanticized view that people have of it somewhat.
And people are still very emotional about it to this day. Almost like when you're talking about the Spanish Civil War, for a lot of people, they're not talking about history, they're talking about politics. They're having a political argument. I feel this way, so ipso facto, I support this. And
no, absolutely. No, and I think that because there is a lot of politics injected into it, and it's, people who, because there was so much involved in it, and there was a lot of propaganda both sides, and it's also seen as almost a litmus test, I think, for some people, at least on the left. Were you fighting fascists in 36, or were you sitting on your hands and not doing anything? And it actually caused problems for some of the U.S. people who fought in the Spanish Civil War and the Abraham Lincoln Battalion and all that, and the George Washington Battalion. Those who come back, they had trouble joining the U.S. Army in World War II because they were deemed to be prematurely anti-fascist. You were against Germany before the rest of us were, sort of thing like that. But also for some of that, it came because a lot of those people were associated with Communist Party or various other things that made them considered politically unreliable.
I think Ernest Hemingway, obviously he fought.
Papa.
He was a
Papa Hemingway.
Or
he was at least he didn't fight. He was a correspondent.
Okay, yeah. One of his characters is an ambulance driver. He wasn't an ambulance driver,
in World War I.
Oh, in World War I he was. Okay.
How much he was driving the ambulance? There's questions about the how much he was on the front line and all that. But he was an ambulance driver in World War I.
Okay.
But he was a journalist, a correspondent, right. For whom the bell tolls, all that.
Right. I shot, what's the name of that guy from, with Sylvia Enos, Ernie?
Oh, I Sank Roger Kimball.
Yes, that's it. Yeah. That book he wrote, that was a great book. Yeah.
Interesting questions. What does a Republican Spain look like? And it does, I think you made the best point earlier, it depends on where is the victory. Is it if it's in the first 6 months, maybe there isn't as much changes. If the Spanish Civil War goes on as it did in reality, but it just ends up with the Republicans winning, like Spain is exhausted and really torn apart.
And honestly, it's maybe on the brink of yet another civil war because, like, think about this. During the war, there's all these militia groups which spring up. Every city has its own militia, and all the militias are armed, and they all have their own party affiliations, their own, hand signals and iconography, and some of them even have their own armored cars and tanks and whatnot. And now, we're going to wind the clock back and go back to being a bourgeois democracy where we're all going to respect votes and whatnot. I mean, we've let the cat out of the bag at this point. And a lot of these movements, they don't jibe with one another. Like, you can't have one government that's half anarcho-syndicalist and half communist. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Or socialist, or or whatever you want to. And then have this weird Basque thing that gets to be basically its own country, non-affected by anything else. Like, yes. What?
Yeah, no, and it is a weird. Yeah, because one of the things why the Republicans lost in some ways is that they were more disorganized. And they had these different competing factions within their government. And if the only thing they're held together sort of is by fighting the nationalists, once that's gone, what the hell's going to come after that?
What are we going to do? Who's actually going to be in charge now, Yeah.
And talking about Basques, just a quick tangent. Basque as a language is fascinating because it's a language isolate. It's a language that's not really related to any of the other languages around it. And apparently some people claim it may be the last pre-Indo-European language that exists in Europe.
Oh, wow. Huh.
I mean, Basque looks interesting. It's very strange.
Yes. I was in Idaho once with my grandfather, and we visited a small town that had a big Basque expatriate community. There was a Basque restaurant and a Basque history museum.
In Idaho?
In Idaho, yeah.
That's weird.
Yeah. I imagine being 5 years old and you never heard of Basque anything before, and it's like, what is this? Where is this? What are you talking about?
Yeah. Fascinating. But yes. So let's put our divergent point at probably the last great Republican offensive of the war, which is the Ebro offensive, or Ebro. I forget the exact way you pronounce it.
We don't speak Spanish.
Yeah, Ebro. Whatever. So long story short,
Abraham.
The Republicans launched this great offensive that made some initial headway against the nationalists, but as with most of their defeat, they got slowly just beaten back and chipped away at, and it just did not succeed. The Republicans had kind of been split in two geographically, and it was kind of aimed to reunite that and kind of push that back. And the Ebro offensive is obviously defeated. But what if it isn't? What if it succeeds the way the Republicans do, and eventually the Spanish Civil War either... And there's two things we need to discuss in this. What if this is the Spanish Civil War ongoing at the time of World War II? How does it get factored into World War II? Does it come another front, as we talked about earlier, or is it just kind of this own conflict kind of raging over here that people kind of forget about, or what's going on?
That's interesting. Maybe Britain starts just out and out supporting the Republic, sending troops, sending material. Because that was a big problem for them, is that ammunition was so scarce and guns were so scarce. I mean, a lot of these units would have 5 or 6 different types of weapons with all these different calibers of guns, and they never have enough of them. Yeah. They don't have grenades. They have soup cans with sticks of dynamite inside of them and stuff. It's it's totally, oh my God, their improvised armored vehicles look crazy. They look totally ridiculous. There's regular bus chassis that they've put
armor
on, and they have pistol holes because they don't have real guns. They have tiny little dinky pistols, so they just pew pew. Nice. It's just, oh my God. So if they had out and out official support of Britain, who's a lot closer than the Soviet Union, and it has a bigger navy, so it could actually help them. I don't know. That would probably help them quite a bit. But does that help them win? Yeah. I mean, the war might just go on for another 4 or 5 years or whatever.
Or honestly, too, if the Ebro offensive happens in this way, if the Republicans and the nationalists are kind of deadlocked, will Spain divide? Will there be a West Spain and an East Spain? Why not? I mean,
The main reason why not is maybe there's not a good dividing line between them. Mm-hmm. It's not like, oh, on this river or on this mountain range, we'll cut it in half.
Would you say there's a natural divide? Was there a natural dividing line between West and East Germany?
No. And not between North and South Korea either.
Or North and South Yemen.
Huh.
Or North and South Sudan.
Or North and South Vietnam as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of arbitrary at some point.
Yeah.
But that would be interesting. Now, what does a post-war world look like in which Spain is divided? West Spain and East Spain. West Spain is nationalist Spain, and East Spain is Republican Spain.
But like mostly, I guess, Catalan dominated because they're the most populous area in there, right?
Spain will be Catalan.
Everyone's going to speak Catalonian now.
It's actually, I guess it's Catalonia, and they speak Catalan, which is kind of related to French, I guess.
Huh. Occitan or Occitan?
Occitan, yeah. The
Interesting.
language of Richard the Lionheart.
That's right. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Crossbow bolt. Uh-oh. But so if you have this, it's interesting, I think, though. Let's say somehow the post-World War II world is basically roughly the same. World War II plays out, and for some reason Spain is kind of divided or whatever, and either side gets involved. Other sudden espionage and various things like that. The funny thing about it is that East Spain may contain the Republicans, the people who are more opposed to the fascist side. But post-war, if we have a rough Cold War happening like it happens in our reality, do we see West Spain kind of becoming allied somewhat with the Western powers, and then East Spain becoming sort of more of a Soviet Union allied? Because obviously the forces within East Spain, this theoretical East Spain, would be much more in line with the Soviet Union. And the anarchists, or at least the Communist Party there certainly is. And that was a big part of the
Well,
Spanish
if anarchists are in charge, they're not going to be friends of Zhukashvili, I'll tell you that much. Josip over there. But yeah, that could be interesting.
Deviationists.
Right, deviationists. They're down deviationists. They're up deviationists. So yeah, you could see like West Spain being this test case where the Allies just dump all this money and stuff, kind of like South Korea, where it's like, let's make this place really nice to make the other one look really bad.
Yeah, and that they kind of conveniently forget that the Falange and all that was kind of associated with.
Yeah,
that maybe West Spain's reintegration within Europe is more rapid than it was now, because they're like, well, we've got to have these allies against the Soviet allied country here. So where it took until early 50s for them to join the UN, or towards I think the 60s before they joined NATO, maybe that happens a little bit sooner.
Yeah. Okay.
And maybe they see US, because remember there still are US bases in Spain, and there certainly were some during the Cold War, like air bases, naval bases. Rota at Spain, I met somebody who actually was stationed there at one point in the Navy. But do you see like U.S. troops actually deployed to like West Spain? Are we going to see like border conflicts? We're going to see Abrams tanks facing off with T-72s outside Madrid. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
I guess, yeah. Another thing, if there's a Republican victory, maybe that affects Portugal. Because, Portugal was very friendly with the Franco regime. But now it's like,
they had a dictator too in Portugal.
Salazar, yeah. I think I said that Salazar was around after Franco. That's not true. That is not true.
Is he pre?
I think, yes, he was before Franco, but I think he stopped in the 60s or something like that. I don't really know.
Well, I think it may have been a military government in Portugal for a while.
Yeah. And then they had some kind of revolution or whatever. Kind of like the Orange Revolution, where it's not a revolution. It's just, okay, let's stop being a dictatorship and be a republic.
A glorious revolution.
Let's be a republic now. And that's when they got rid of their colonies in like Mozambique.
Mozambique.
No.
Angola, Savimbi.
No. India, please don't take that from me. Goa is mine.
It was taken in the 60s before, actually. Pretty much because the Indians said we're going to take it,
I was going to mention that during the Falklands episode, is that was a big reason why the Argentinians did what they did, is that they looked at Goa and they were like, well, India just took this thing that they'd been complaining about forever. They just took it and nobody cared. So, hey, let's try to do the same thing. So, like, let's say the Republic wins, like we were talking about earlier. Obviously, most of the people who were fighting for the Republic were, pretty zazzed about changing Spain and making this new society. But kind of following the example of the 1917 revolution in Russia. But actually, Stalin didn't want that. Stalin wanted Spain to become a bourgeois democracy, wanted it to just become like a normal state that, he had a lot of influence over, a lot of power in, like a large communist party, but he didn't want it to be a communist country. He still wanted capitalism and private property.
And why is that?
I think it might be part of that whole socialism in one country thing. It's like the movement needs to come from the Soviet Union. Like the Soviet Union's my main concern, and the rest of the world is, I don't want there to be a rival to the Soviet Union. I don't want there to be another communist country that I can't control. So I'd rather it be a parliamentary democracy that I have like a pretty strong hand in guiding, but not like a bunch of super radical, like, yeah, woo.
Exactly.
Thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, not what I would have expected.
No, you wouldn't have.
But I mean, like, the Russo-Finnish War, Stalin's most ambitious aim was not to annex Finland. It was to make Finland into a parliamentary democracy that he had a lot of influence over. He didn't want it to be a Soviet socialist republic.
And to take some territory.
And to take territory, of course. Those islands. I need those islands in the Bay of Finland.
The Karelian Isthmus. We need it.
Need it. We need like 30 miles of territory above Leningrad. Need that.
They still have it till this day.
That's true. They do. Karelia is still part of friggin' Russia right now. And there's still Karelians today, too.
I didn't know that. Yeah, no, I think it would be... It's interesting. I think this conversation has raised a lot of interesting questions, and I think it shows... more so than something like the Falklands episode, how much there's only so many ways that the Falklands War can be different, but the Spanish Civil War has like a lot of impact, and is really this pivotal moment, and is really kind of a dress rehearsal for World War II. Yeah, like to a degree.
Yeah, to a degree. Like the Soviets learned a bunch of stuff. They learned about tank design and tank usage. They had the T-26, which was like this super light tank that moved extremely slow. It was based on some Vickers tank. They just changed the gun on it. But it was like a mainstay for the Republic because it's like the only armor they had. There's the BT-5, which was a cruiser tank, a fast tank.
Cruiser tank?
Yes. And that was actually used in that Battle of the Ebro. They tried to go behind the lines without infantry support and got torn to pieces. And that was...
You gotta have infantry supporting your tanks. You gotta have infantry supporting your tanks. No matter what the final scene of Fury tells you, that a tank can basically beat a bunch of infantry, that fight should have been over way before it was.
Probably because they were fighting Volksgrenadier, like grandpas and kids and stuff, unlike in the movie. But like in reality, that might be the reason why. I don't know.
You need infantry to support tanks, mutually supporting here. No,
moral support.
Yeah, no, Spain was this real kind of fascinating, and it's a dress rehearsal much more so in the way that is there really a dress rehearsal for World War I? Well, the Balkans Wars, I guess, and all that. But
okay.
It's kind of this interesting conglomeration of, because you have the West kind of sort of sending some support, but it's really more individual, and it's really, and it sets this tenor of, the people opposing fascism are communists, which I think damaged some of the Western democracies too. It's interesting.
Well, there's other works about the Spanish Civil War. There's a little thing called Kaiserreich. Have you ever heard of this?
Yes, I have.
You might have heard of this.
Perhaps.
There's a Spanish Civil War in that game that's 3 ways. There's
3 ways between what?
Between Alfonsoists, Carlists, and Anarcho-Syndicalists.
Oh my goodness!
Because remember, there's no communism in Kaiserreich. So
is there? Oh, that's right.
That lady like kills Lenin or whatever. And and it's just the CNT-FAI. There's no like communists or socialists anywhere. And then the Carlist leader is that guy, that Xavier Parma de Bourbon or whatever his name is. But that's kind of interesting.
There is more of it. Obviously, there's like a short story we mentioned with Federico Garcia Lorca and one of the alternate warriors, and we were like, what's the difference? Still can't figure out.
I think that's more of what they call a secret history, where it's, this could have reasonably happened. We just didn't know because it's not in history. Let me think. Oh, something I was kind of thinking of, another kind of divergence thing, is that right before the war started, the founder of the Phalange was this guy named Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera. And he got arrested by the Republic for whatever reason. And so he was in jail when the war started. And as a result, they were like, oh, well, this guy's a traitor. He was working with these guys and he didn't tell us. We're going to execute him. But what if he doesn't get arrested? So you've got this like charismatic pseudo-fascist leader. The Falange, as far as I can tell, isn't really fascism the same way we would think of like the Nazis being fascists. It's different.
Yes.
They're like nationalist syndicalists, whatever that means. But that was like a boon for Franco, is the fact that he got executed, is that now you don't have a rival. That's one less rival you have to deal with.
Yes.
So you could see a lot more division on the nationalist side if he was alive.
Yeah.
You know? That could be an interesting thing.
No, absolutely. Do we have these different potential leaders within the nationalist movement and all that? And that also brings up part two is that like the sheer scale of atrocity both sides inflict upon each other. And this is not something just limit. The nationalists certainly shoot a lot of people, but the Republicans did too. And there was a backlash against the clergy, mass shootings of the clergy that really pissed off a lot of more traditional Spanish Catholics and things like that. And that allowed the Spanish, Spain is a very Catholic country and historically always has been. And I think that allowed the nationalist movement to take up the cross, if you will.
Yeah.
That they could take that as a weapon, like we are the restorers of traditional Spanish morality against these godless communists who are running around shooting priests and stuff like that.
And just like destroying churches, burning churches down. There's like some picture with a bunch of Republican soldiers shooting at a statue of Jesus. What's wrong with you guys? Like what? Digging up nuns and then just like desecrating their bodies out in the open in the street and stuff. Destroying like saint artifacts. It's like, I don't know. That's never made sense to me why anyone would do that.
Well, I think it's sort of this reaction of like the extremes come out in these situations, both sides, these sort of extremes of depravity almost in a sense. Just people are like, well, we're going to pay back all these people, and they just become these. And but that's what revolutions traditionally are. Like, and I think we in the U.S. are spoiled because we think of the American Revolution, and there actually was some certainly
tarring and feathering,
massacring of your opponents, but it happened nowhere. I mean, we think like the American Revolution is like crossing the Delaware at Trenton, sort of thing like that. And there was some fighting. We beat the British at Saratoga, and then there was Yorktown. And like overall, while there certainly was conflict and there was bloodiness, nowhere near the scale of what revolution traditionally means. You want to see what a revolution's like? Russian Revolution, French Revolution, Spanish Civil War, Chinese Revolution. This is what happens. A lot of massacring. There's a lot of score settling, whether or not it's even based off of the predominant ideological background of whatever you're doing. There tends to be a lot of score settling and a lot of just killing.
So it's not really, in some cases, an ideological thing. It's just a I hate that guy thing.
Yeah, well, that was a lot of the kulakization of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It's just like not the nicest people in town would just point out their enemies and be like, they're kulaks. So, okay.
Okay, all right. So that, that's kind of a related thing, is that the Great Purge was happening basically at the same time as the Spanish Civil War. That started in 1936, I think right after or right before Stalin decided to intervene in the conflict.
Instead of purging those generals, sent him to Spain.
Well, that's another thing, is that he sent a bunch of people to work in Spain kind of as an excuse to then purge them when they came back. It's like, well, you did a terrible job, or, oh, you were exposed to these elements or whatever. Mind games, Another work of alternate history we found was that book Anarchia, which is written by one of the contributors to those short story compilations, Brad Lineweaver. Anarchia, which I don't know, looks weird. Neat, I guess.
It's looks like an old school Hollywood. It's strange.
Yeah, kind of reminds me of the Firebringers story or whatever, where there's all those celebrities and stuff. There's like all these celebrities there for some reason, Hedy Lamarr and whatnot. Like, maybe it's not good. I don't know.
Never read it, so I couldn't tell you. The Spanish Civil War is fascinating. I'm glad that we've addressed this because it's a conflict that foreshadows the Second World War, but also doesn't, but also is unique in its own way. And, the Iberian Peninsula, when it comes to the world wars in recent history, just doesn't get as much attention. When you talk about any discussion to what's happening in the 1500s in Europe, Spain is central to it.
Yeah. Spain used to be the biggest empire on earth.
Yeah, on earth, in the 1530s or whatever.
Your king's also the Holy Roman Emperor.
And under Charles V and all
Own
that.
the friggin' Philippines,
Yeah. Spain was this incredible world power and player on the scene in the 1500s particularly. One of the queens of England, Catherine of Aragon, is Spanish. But it just plays this less and less role, and it just seems to sink into the backwater of like the 18 and 1900s, other than the Peninsula War, and then for these 3 years it's all on the minds of the world, and then it sinks back again. Obviously it's not like it's been forgotten about, but it seems like the axis of what's happening, what's important, seems to transfer north. It's moving north towards Britain and France and Germany and the Netherlands and all that.
It's crazy how terrible things were in Spain right before the Civil War. Like, a huge portion of the population was completely illiterate.
Very backwards in many ways outside. Yeah. You go to the rural areas, very different.
Yeah. And this is a country that used to have like the biggest empire ever, and now people don't even have good roads, barely have any industry. It's just, oh God.
What industry was actually mainly in the hands of the Republicans.
Yes,
in
that's
Barcelona
right.
and Madrid, Valencia, things like that. So
got huge organizations like the UGT, which is like a great big trade union organization led by Largo Caballero, who's also in the PSOE, which is like the Socialist Party. So he's kind of striding both organizations. It was like a big deal at the time.
Yeah. Fascinating period of time, and I'm glad that we discussed it.
Let's think of other things to throw in here. Speaking of rivals to Franco conveniently dying at just the right moment, Emilio Moya, also died in a plane accident.
Yeah, well, this is the 1930s. Planes are not as good as they are now.
Planes are very dangerous.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned this feeling of fighting the Reds as being like this kind of crusade or whatever. A lot of nationalists called themselves crusaders, which is kind of ironic because also one of the most ardent and effective fighters in the nationalist cause are Moroccans, Muslim Moroccans.
Yeah, those the veterans of the Spanish Foreign Legion. Yeah,
the Moroccans are fighting the Reconquista against the Reds.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, which is funny enough.
Yeah,
another interesting period of time, the Reconquista. I need to learn more about that.
Yeah.
And interesting enough, as of the time we're recording this episode, there are still veterans of the Spanish Civil War alive.
Wow.
Not a ton.
Any of them International Brigade people?
I think there may be. I know the last American veteran died a couple years ago, the International Brigades, but I think the last veteran, the Condor Legion, died a couple years ago too. But this was a pretty all-consuming conflict, and a lot of people who were younger fought in it, so there could, if they lived to be pretty old, could still be alive today.
I thought the Condor Legion was nothing but airplanes, but actually it was like ground troops and
a little bit, but I think it was primarily air troops, because you had to be careful because the Germans officially weren't really involved. It was kind of an open secret, but they weren't like parading around like off goes the brave Condor Legion. I think that with planes and fighters and stuff like that, you can maintain the veneer of let's say one of your Condor Legion pilots gets shot down behind Republican lines, and they're like, look at this German, he's fighting for them. They could probably write it off as, well, oh, that's like an adventurer, who went to go volunteer to fight for the Spanish. Ground troops fighting is like military units. It's a lot harder to be like, that's just a bunch of people who conveniently were in the German army 2 months ago and now are all went as a group to Spain to go fight against the Republicans.
One of which was Oscar Dirlewanger?
I think it's Dirlewanger.
Dirlewanger, yeah, that infamous war criminal, yeah.
But the real people who got experience in Spain from the German side who became notable were pilots. They were Werner Mulders, the Vadi. Vadi from the story Vadi.
Oh, right, yeah. Which means
Fati, I guess. Fati, whatever. VF.
Yeah, like Volk, Volk.
Yeah. Vogel.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing.
And Fati means father.
It does. He was the leading German ace of the Condor Legion. And then you had Adolf Galland, who later became very important in the German fighter organization and actually in the Bundeswaffe, the German Air Force after the war, was also a veteran of Spain. Then you had Hugo Sperl, who was the head of it. Yes.
With his monocle.
Yeah, that guy had a strong monocle. Strong monocle game. Yeah, so primarily those people, though there were other... That was probably the most notable. And then you did have American pilots and stuff fighting there, too, and all that.
I mean, the most famous volunteer, George Orwell. He wrote a book about it.
Homage to Catalonia.
Yeah, I read most of it.
And being in the international brigades or fighting there as an international fighter was not as exciting as you think.
Yeah, in the book, a lot of it is just him sleeping in trenches, feeling really cold, talking about how he's covered in lice and stuff. I mean, it was interesting, but it's not exactly action-packed, that book.
Yeah, no. No, but that's what it was like. I mean, they were really more for show. They did certainly fight at times, but they were... And remember, too, some of them were Great War veterans, but this wasn't like these were military units. A lot of these people were like idealistic. They're writers or workers or artists and stuff like that who are so caught up, fighting against the fascists that they go there. But like, if they have no military training, they show up and they're like, "Oh yes, I used to be a university professor in the UK. I'm ready to fight against the fascists." So do you have any military training? Nope. So do you know how to use a rifle? Not really. But I've got passion to fight. It's like forging that into a workable military unit takes time, and I think they took very heavy casualties at the beginning of the war because a lot of these people, revolutionary fervor is great. It doesn't do much against a machine gun.
Right. Plus,
your desire to fight the Germans doesn't translate. If you get shot 5 times in the chest, it's only so much you could do.
Esprit de corps.
Yeah.
Plus, with George Orwell's example, he was fighting for the POUM, which was anti-Stalinist communists, because he claims he didn't really understand the distinction between these organizations. Kind of like how most people are when they see these acronyms. They're like, "What the hell is that?" So
PSOE, POUM,
the UGT, the CNT, the FAI, what is this? So he just ended up with these people and then realized, oh no, people are trying to kill me now because I chose the wrong side in this. Because there was that May incident where the POUM was attacked by the Republic.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's a fascinating conflict, and one that I'm glad I read that book because I was like, I want to learn more about the Spanish Civil War. I'm like, wow, there was a whole lot that I didn't realize because I knew the basic nationalists, Republicans, that sort of thing, but didn't realize the extent that it went. So.
Yeah, and I didn't realize the complexity, all the different factions and stuff. Because I was reading that Turtledove book, and one of the reasons I started it, I was like, oh, this will give me better perspective on the Spanish Civil War, but not really. Because the Republic is just the Republic. They never really get into the details of all these different factions inside of it. And the Nationalists are just the Nationalists.
So it's fascinating. Really interesting. Yeah. Glad we discussed it.
Yeah. This was a lot of fun.
So this is Matt signing off.
And this is Max signing off.
Have a good day, guys.
Okay, so you know how the guy who founded the Falange is Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, and the guy who was the former dictator of Spain before the Republic was Miguel Primo de Rivera, their father and son. But every time I hear Primo de Rivera, I think Pasta Primavera. Every single time. And I have to struggle not to say Pasta Primavera.
No, I